How does a quiet, soft-spoken grandmother, a woman who once baked cookies for the neighborhood children, become the center of one of the most chilling mass murder cases in her state's history? It wasn't a drive-by shooting. It wasn't a violent home invasion. There were no masked intruders, no desperate robbers. Instead, the killer lived inside that same modest, single-story house. And her victims, they were not strangers. They were her blood, her own 5 grandchildren. In the days that followed, the news would tear through the quiet, tree-lined neighborhood like a storm ripping through calm waters. Friends and neighbors stared at their television screens in disbelief, replaying the same footage over and over, as if they might somehow find an explanation in her face, a twitch of guilt, a flicker of regret. But all they saw was an elderly woman with tired eyes, standing handcuffed between 2 deputies. The headlines were merciless. Grandmother poisons 5 grandchildren. Cyanide cocktail in quiet suburb shocks nation. Some called her a monster, a cold-blooded killer who deserved the harshest penalty the law could offer. Others whispered about her life, about the crushing weight she carried, about how society had failed her long before she ever failed those children. And somewhere, in between the judgment and the pity, was a deeper question that no one could answer. How does love turn into something lethal? This is not a story about a hardened criminal with a long rap sheet. This is a story about a woman who once lived a life that was ordinary, even gentle, until the day her world collided with responsibility she could no longer bear. A mother who abandoned her role, 5 children left in chaos, and a grandmother pushed past the breaking point. The events you're about to hear are true in their emotional weight and brutal in their outcome. They will force you to confront an uncomfortable reality that sometimes tragedy is not born from pure malice, but from exhaustion, despair, and a system that looked the other way. What happened inside that little house was not quick, nor was it without choice. She prepared for it. She thought about it, and when the moment came, she acted. This is the story of how a grandmother from a peaceful street walked down a path that would end with her sitting in a courtroom, facing a sentence that would determine the rest of her life. And by the end, you may find yourself questioning not just her actions, but the world that shaped them. The street where Margaret Maggie Hollis lived didn't seem like the kind of place where terrible things could happen. Maplewood Lane was the kind of neighborhood where people waved from their porches, where dogs barked lazily behind picket fences, and where the loudest noise you might hear was the hum of a lawnmower on a Saturday morning. Maggie's house sat at the end of the street, a small, weathered home with white paint that had begun to peel near the windows, and a porch swing that creaked whenever the wind picked up. She had lived there alone for over a decade, ever since her husband passed away. In the evenings, she would water the small patch of marigolds in her front yard, and the neighbors like Nancy Dalton next door would nod politely as they passed by. Life was slow, predictable, and that was just how she liked it. But everything changed one rainy afternoon when a battered silver sedan pulled into her driveway. Her daughter, Melissa Hollis, stepped out, a woman in her early 30s with smudged mascara and a suitcase that looked as if it had been dragged through 3 states. She didn't come alone. One by one, 5 children spilled out of the car, their voices loud and restless, their arms clutching stuffed animals and plastic bags of clothes. 9-year-old Ethan was the first out, slamming the car door with a kind of careless force that made Maggie flinch. 8-year-old Logan followed close behind, already bickering with his older brother. 7-year-old Sophie emerged clutching a worn plastic doll, her sharp eyes scanning the yard for something to get into. 3-year-old Caleb waddled toward the porch steps, thumb in mouth. And finally, 2-year-old Emma, the smallest, clung to Melissa's leg until she was nudged forward. Melissa had just finalized her divorce. She spoke quickly, almost as if she wanted to get the words out before Maggie could respond. "It's just for a while, Mom. I need some time to figure things out." Maggie, who would later be called a killer, nodded quietly. She had no reason to refuse. They were family. And besides, she thought, maybe this is what the house needs. Laughter. Life. At first, there was a kind of joy in having the house full again, the sound of footsteps down the hallway, the clink of cereal bowls in the morning. Even the occasional shouting match between Ethan and Logan seemed harmless enough. But as the weeks passed, the joy began to fade. Melissa was rarely home. She would leave in the early evening and sometimes not return for days. When she did, she smelled of cigarette smoke and cheap perfume, her voice hoarse from long nights out. Her excuses were vague. I was with friends, or I needed a break, and she brushed off any questions about work or money. The children, left in Maggie's care, were a handful. Caleb cried whenever she wasn't in the room. Emma seemed determined to pull over anything within reach. Sophie had a habit of sneaking into drawers and pulling out whatever caught her eye: scissors, coins, even a box of matches once. And the boys, Ethan and Logan, were in a constant tug-of-war for control, their scuffles often ending with something broken. The house, once quiet and orderly, became a place of constant noise and mess. Toys underfoot, spilled juice on the carpet, screams that woke her at 2 a.m. Maggie tried to keep up cooking meals, cleaning the kitchen 3 times a day, doing endless loads of laundry, but her back ached, her hands trembled, and her savings account, already small, was shrinking. Still, she said nothing. She told herself it was temporary, that Melissa would get back on her feet, that things would calm down. But deep inside, something had begun to change. A heaviness settled in her chest, not just fatigue, but a creeping sense of being trapped. She had given her life to raising her own children, and now, in her later years, she was doing it all over again, only this time, without a partner, without the energy, and without any help. It was the beginning of a storm, one that no one on Maplewood Lane could see coming. The first month passed in a blur of sleepless nights and scattered meals. At first, Margaret Maggie Hollis told herself it was simply a period of adjustment. Children take time to settle, after all. But as autumn leaves began to fall on Maplewood Lane, it became painfully clear that nothing was settling. In fact, things were getting worse. Melissa's absences grew longer. Some nights she wouldn't come home at all, leaving Maggie to feed, bathe, and calm 5 restless souls alone. On the rare evenings Melissa did appear, she often stumbled through the front door well past midnight, her hair tangled, her makeup smudged, eyes glassy and unfocused. The scent of cigarette smoke clung to her clothes, mingling with the sharper tang of alcohol. Whenever Maggie tried to speak with her, Melissa would wave her off. "It's fine, Mom. I've got it handled." Handled? The bills were stacking up on the kitchen counter. The fridge was emptying faster than Maggie could keep it stocked. And the noise never stopped. From the moment the children woke until they finally collapsed into bed, it was chaos. Ethan, at 9 years old, had a habit of slamming doors when he didn't get his way. He and Logan, only a year apart, seemed locked in a constant battle for dominance, shouting and shoving until someone cried. Sophie, at 7, was clever in a way that made trouble disappearing into the bedroom and emerging with handfuls of items she wasn't supposed to touch: nail polish, coins, even a kitchen knife once, which sent a jolt of fear through Maggie's chest. The 2 youngest were barely out of diapers. Caleb cried whenever she left the room, his small hands reaching desperately for her. Emma seemed determined to pull over anything within reach: lamps, laundry baskets, cups of scalding tea. It was like trying to contain 5 different storms, each moving in its own direction, each ready to tear through the fragile order of her home. Her back began to ache constantly. The skin under her eyes turned a shadowy purple from nights spent waking every few hours. Meals were no longer proper dinners, just whatever she could assemble: quickly grilled cheese, instant noodles, crackers and peanut butter. The house itself was changing, too. Toys littered every surface, clothes piled up on chairs. The carpet was dotted with juice stains and crumbs. She cleaned constantly, yet the place never looked clean. And then there was the sound. If silence had once been her comfort, now it was a memory. Every day was filled with shrieks, the crash of something breaking, the endless loop of cartoons blaring from the TV. Sometimes she would step into the bathroom, close the door, and press her palms over her ears, just to feel what it was like to have a moment without noise. Money became another weight on her shoulders. Melissa wasn't working, and whatever child support she was supposed to receive never seemed to arrive. Groceries, utilities, school supplies, all of it came out of Maggie's modest savings. She began skipping her own medications, stretching out the doses to make them last. One morning, as she stood at the sink rinsing out a coffee mug, she caught sight of herself in the window's reflection. Her hair was limp, her face pale. There was a tightness in her mouth she didn't recognize, a look of constant strain. Neighbors began to notice changes, too. Nancy Dalton from next door dropped off a bag of groceries one afternoon, claiming she'd bought too much by accident. The mailman lingered a moment longer than usual, asking how she was doing. She brushed them off with the same answer she gave everyone. "We're fine, just busy." But inside she felt anything but fine. She started waking in the middle of the night with her heart racing, unsure if a noise had startled her or if her own body was sounding some kind of alarm. She would lie there in the dark, listening to the faint breathing of the children in the next room, wondering how she was going to keep doing this, not for weeks, but possibly for years. Whenever Melissa returned, she was defensive and quick to anger. If Maggie brought up the children's behavior or the strain it was putting on her, Melissa would snap. "You think it's easy for me. You think I wanted this," she'd shout, before slamming her bedroom door and sleeping until noon. There were moments, small ones, that almost made it feel worth it. Caleb would curl up in her lap, thumb in mouth, and drift to sleep while she rubbed his back. Sophie would draw pictures of the house and hand them over with shy pride. But those moments were rare, drowned out by the constant grind of exhaustion. Winter crept in, and with it, shorter days. The cold seemed to settle in her bones. She moved slower. She smiled less. And though she didn't realize it yet, something inside her was quietly hardening, the way ice forms beneath a thin layer of water. She began to think about what life had been like before the quiet mornings, the time to tend her marigolds, the evenings spent reading by lamplight. It felt like another lifetime, as unreachable as a dream. More than once, she caught herself thinking, "I can't do this anymore." And yet, there was no one to take her place, no relatives offering to help, no intervention from child services, despite the fact that Melissa was gone most nights. The pressure kept building, day after day, like water behind a dam, and sooner or later, every dam breaks. By February, the winter cold wasn't the only thing biting at Margaret Maggie Hollis. Something else had settled in a constant tightness in her chest, a slow-burning frustration that never truly went away. It wasn't just the noise anymore. It was the feeling that she had disappeared inside her own life. She no longer existed as herself. She was simply the caretaker, the cook, the cleaner, the referee for 5 little storms that never stopped swirling Ethan, Logan, Sophie, Caleb, and Emma. Her conversations with Melissa had devolved into short, sharp exchanges or no exchanges at all. If Melissa was home, she was in her room with the door shut, music playing loud enough to drown out the world. Sometimes the bass from her speakers would rattle the hallway at midnight, and the children would still be awake, restless and hungry. "Melissa, they need you," Maggie would say through the closed door. And Melissa's muffled response would come back, laced with irritation. "I'll get to it. Just stop nagging me." The nagging, as Melissa called it, came from desperation. Maggie had tried every way she knew to make things work: schedules, chore charts, bedtime routines, but nothing stuck. The children ignored her. Melissa ignored her. And the house felt more and more like a cage. Sleep was the first thing Maggie lost. She'd lie in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying the day's arguments in her head. She would think about the bills on the counter, the grocery list she couldn't afford to finish, the way her hands trembled when she poured a cup of tea because she hadn't eaten properly. Her appetite was gone. Food tasted like cardboard. Coffee, once her comfort, only made her stomach knot tighter. Then came the headaches, deep, pounding aches that wrapped around her skull and made her snap at the smallest noises. The children noticed, though perhaps not in the way adults would. Ethan became defiant, testing her limits with every request. Sophie seemed to sense her weakness, using moments of chaos to slip into rooms and dig through drawers. Logan picked more fights with his older brother. Caleb cried more often. And Emma, once the quietest, had developed an ear-piercing scream whenever she didn't get her way. One night in March, Maggie reached her limit. It was almost midnight when she heard a crash from the living room. She stumbled out of bed, her joints stiff, to find Ethan and Logan wrestling near the coffee table. A lamp shattered at their feet. Caleb was wailing in the corner. Melissa was nowhere to be found. She didn't shout at them. She didn't even move to clean the mess. She just stood there, staring, as if her body had locked up. Her heart was beating hard in her chest, but her mind felt quiet, too quiet. She sent the boys to their room, scooped up Caleb, and sat in the dark until his crying stopped. Then she put him in his crib and went back to bed. But she didn't sleep. Instead, she thought about what would happen if she simply walked out the door and never came back. She pictured herself on a bus, heading anywhere, leaving the chaos behind. But she knew she couldn't do it. The children would be left alone. And that thought twisted in her gut. It was in those sleepless hours that darker ideas began to take root. She didn't think of them as plans at first, just fleeting notions born of desperation. Thoughts like, what if there was a way to make the noise stop? What if the chaos could end in a single day? She hated herself for thinking it. And yet, the thought kept returning. April brought no relief. Melissa's absences grew longer. The bills grew larger. The weather warmed. But Maggie's mood did not. The marigolds in her yard wilted in the sun, untended. She didn't have the energy to water them. One afternoon, after chasing Caleb and Emma away from the kitchen stove, she slumped into the chair by the window. Across the street, she saw Nancy Dalton unloading groceries from her car, her teenage son helping carry the bags inside. The scene was so ordinary, so normal, that it made Maggie's throat ache. When Melissa finally came home that night, reeking of alcohol, Maggie tried again. "You can't just leave them with me all the time," she said, voice trembling. "I can't keep this up. I'm not young anymore." Melissa rolled her eyes. "Then don't. No one's forcing you." That sentence, those 6 words lodged in Maggie's chest like a shard of glass. No one's forcing you. But wasn't that exactly what was happening? The circumstances, the lack of help, the indifference from her own daughter, it all forced her into this role. And now Melissa had the gall to pretend it was a choice. That night, she lay in bed staring at the ceiling again. Only this time, the thought of escape didn't involve buses or running away. It was something final, something that would silence the noise forever. She tried to push it away, but it followed her into the next day, and the next. By the time May rolled around, the idea had stopped feeling like a nightmare and started feeling like an answer. She hated herself for it. She prayed for a miracle that never came. And all the while, the sound of her grandchildren's laughter, once a joy, now grated like a constant reminder that she was trapped. Soon, Maggie would make her decision. And when she did, The quiet she longed for would come at a cost no one could ever undo. The morning of June 14th began quietly, too quietly. Margaret Maggie Hollis woke before the children, the pale light of dawn slipping through the blinds. For a moment, she just sat at the edge of her bed, hands resting on her knees, listening to the silence. It was the kind of silence she used to love, soft, still, untouched. But now it felt fragile, like thin glass ready to shatter the moment little feet hit the floor. She moved slowly, as if every step was deliberate. Boiling water for tea, opening the cupboard, the faint clink of a spoon against a mug. On the counter sat a small paper bag, the kind that might hold medicine from a pharmacy. Inside was a plastic jar with no label, filled with fine, off-white powder. Cyanide. She had purchased it 2 days earlier from a man she knew only as Rick, who ran a pest control supply shop on the far edge of town. She told him she had a rat problem in her shed. He didn't ask questions. He slid the jar into the bag, took her cash, and sent her on her way. She hadn't touched it until now. The children began to stir upstairs. Soon they would be in the kitchen, asking for cereal, juice, pancakes. Maggie opened the fridge and took out a carton of orange juice. The bright color looked almost cheerful in the morning light. Her hands shook as she unscrewed the jar. The smell hit her instantly sharp, bitter, metallic. She coughed, eyes watering, but kept going. She poured the powder into a glass, added juice, and stirred until it vanished. Then she poured the poisoned juice into 6 cups, 5 for the children, 1 for herself. She wasn't planning to survive. Ethan was the first into the kitchen, hair sticking up in all directions. Logan trailed behind him, rubbing his eyes. Sophie skipped in, clutching her worn plastic doll. Caleb toddled toward her, arms up. Emma clung to Sophie's leg, her thumb in her mouth. Maggie picked up Caleb and held him for a second longer than usual, feeling the small weight against her chest. "Breakfast is ready," she said softly. They gathered around the table, chattering about cartoons and the possibility of going to the park later. Maggie set a cup in front of each child. Her own cup sat untouched at the counter. Her heart pounded. Her hands felt numb. She waited for someone to notice something, a strange smell, a bitter taste. But the children drank without question. Caleb made a face. "It's sour," he said. She smiled faintly. "Just drink it, sweetheart." The first signs came within minutes. Ethan complained of dizziness. Sophie put her head down on the table. Logan's eyes widened as he clutched his stomach. Caleb began to cry, his small hands pressing against his belly. Emma whimpered, leaning against Sophie. "Grandma, I don't feel good," Ethan said, his voice shaking. Maggie's chest tightened. For a split second, she wanted to snatch the cups away, call an ambulance, take it all back. But she didn't move. She just sat there, frozen, as the chaos unfolded. Sophie slid sideways off her chair. Logan stumbled toward the counter, then collapsed. Caleb screamed once, then fell silent, his body twitching. Emma's cup rolled from her small hand, juice pooling on the floor. The kitchen was filled with choked gasps and weak cries. The air smelled faintly of almonds, the telltale scent of cyanide. Maggie stood, moved to the counter, picked up her own cup. But she couldn't bring it to her lips. In the end, she didn't drink. Instead, she walked to the phone and dialed 911. Her voice was calm, almost eerily so. "My grandchildren. They're all sick. They're not waking up." The operator's tone shifted instantly. "Ma'am, I'm sending help. Are they breathing? Can you—" Maggie hung up before the instructions came. When the paramedics arrived, they found her sitting at the table, hands folded neatly in her lap, eyes fixed on the floor. The children lay where they had fallen. 2 were already gone. 3 were rushed to the hospital, but pronounced dead within the hour. One paramedic later told police he had never seen such stillness in a suspect. No tears, no shouting, just a kind of resigned emptiness. When an officer asked what happened, Maggie answered in a voice barely above a whisper, "I couldn't do it anymore." And in that moment, the life she had known, the quiet street, the marigolds, the familiar rhythm of her days was gone forever. The wail of sirens shattered the calm of Maplewood Lane. Neighbors stepped onto their porches, shielding their eyes against the flashing red and blue lights that painted the street. 2 ambulances screeched to a halt in front of Margaret Maggie Hollis's small white house. Paramedics spilled out, carrying equipment and moving with a speed that told everyone this wasn't a routine call. Within minutes, the sound of heavy boots pounded through the hallway. The front door swung wider, and the air carried something strange, a sharp, bitter scent that made one firefighter gag before covering his mouth. 5 pediatric patients, unresponsive. A paramedic's voice rang out from inside. "Get the stretchers, now." The sight that followed would haunt every first responder on the scene. 2 children lay side by side on the kitchen floor, Ethan and Sophie, their faces pale, lips tinged with blue. Logan was slumped in a chair, head back, eyes half closed, a thin trickle of foam at the corner of his mouth. The 2 youngest, Caleb and Emma, were curled on the tile, small bodies twitching with the last remnants of muscle spasms. And in the middle of it all, Maggie sat motionless, her hands clasped tightly, her gaze locked on the wall. She didn't speak, didn't cry, didn't even turn her head when the paramedics brushed past her. One EMT knelt by Ethan, placing 2 fingers on his neck, searching for a pulse. He looked up at his partner and shook his head. "Time of death, 9:12, the medic said quietly. Outside, the crowd of neighbors grew. Nancy Dalton from next door clutched her housecoat, eyes wide with horror. "What happened?" "Are they okay?" she asked anyone who would answer. But no one could. By the time the stretchers rolled out, 3 small bodies were covered with white sheets. The other 2 were rushed toward the ambulances, their limbs limp, their faces still. The sirens wailed again, fading into the distance as the vehicles sped toward the county hospital. Police officers began taping off the property, the bright yellow barrier stark against the neat hedges. Reporters arrived within the hour, cameras snapping, microphones angled toward any willing mouth. "She's lived here for years," Nancy told a news crew, her voice trembling. "She's always been so polite, so quiet. I can't believe she'd hurt them." Others weren't so shocked. A man from down the street recounted seeing Maggie looking worn out in recent months, her hair unkempt, her clothes rumpled. Something was eating at her, he said. You could see it in her face. Inside the house, detectives moved methodically. They collected the cups from the kitchen table, still half filled with orange juice. They took samples from the sticky puddles on the tile. They noted the faint smell of almonds that lingered in the air. One investigator picked up a small paper bag from the counter, its folded top marked by greasy fingerprints. Inside was the jar of cyanide, less than half full. When asked where she had gotten it, Maggie simply said, "For the rats." The medical examiner's van pulled up, and the remaining 2 children's bodies were loaded inside. At the hospital, doctors confirmed what the paramedics had feared: the poison had acted fast, and there was nothing they could do. All 5 grandchildren were gone. The news spread beyond Maplewood Lane within hours. By noon, local TV stations were running continuous coverage, showing aerial shots of the cordoned-off house. By evening, national networks had picked up the story. 5 children poisoned in their grandmother's home, one anchor said gravely. Authorities believe the suspect acted alone. The internet ignited. Social media timelines filled with outrage, disbelief, and speculation. Hashtags bearing Maggie's name trended within hours. People argued in comment sections, some calling for her immediate execution, others demanding answers about why she had been left to care for the children in the first place. Melissa arrived at the scene late that afternoon, driven by a friend. The moment she stepped out of the car, cameras swarmed. "Do you have anything to say about your children?" one reporter shouted. Melissa's face was a mask of shock, then anguish. She ran toward the police tape, shouting her children's names: Ethan, Logan, Sophie, Caleb, Emma, only to be stopped by an officer. "Let me see them. Please, let me see my babies," she screamed, her voice breaking. The officer shook his head. The scene was still active. Witnesses said Melissa collapsed to her knees, sobbing uncontrollably. But for some onlookers, sympathy was hard to find. "She left those kids here all the time," one neighbor muttered. "She's not innocent in this." By evening, Maggie was led out of the house in handcuffs. The crowd was silent at first, then a few angry shouts broke out. "Murderer," someone yelled. "Monster," another voice called. She didn't look up. Her head was bowed, her expression unreadable. At the police station, she was booked on 5 counts of first-degree murder. Her mugshot showed a woman with deep lines etched into her face, her eyes ringed with exhaustion. The official statement from Police Chief Randall was brief but chilling. "This is one of the most tragic cases we've seen in our county. 5 young lives were lost today. We will seek justice to the fullest extent of the law." In the days that followed, Maplewood Lane became a kind of morbid landmark. Strangers drove by slowly, craning their necks to see the little white house where the unimaginable had happened. The porch swing still creaked in the wind. The marigolds in the yard, once bright, had begun to wilt. And behind bars, in a small holding cell, Maggie waited not for visitors, not for sympathy, but for the inevitable. Because whether she felt it was justice or not, the state was already preparing to seek her death. The trial began 8 months after the murders, but for the people of Maplewood Lane and much of the state, the case had never really left the headlines. On the morning of this first day, the courthouse steps were packed with reporters. Cameras flashed as Margaret Maggie Hollis was led inside, flanked by 2 deputies. She wore a plain beige sweater and slacks. Her hair was pulled neatly back, but her face was pale, almost expressionless. Inside, the courtroom was already full. The first 2 rows were reserved for family members of the victims. Melissa sat in the second row, her eyes hollow, her hands twisting a tissue. She hadn't spoken to her mother since the day of the arrests, but she hadn't stayed away either. When Judge Whitmore entered, the room fell silent. The prosecution wasted no time in laying out their case. "This was no accident," said Daniel Briggs, the lead prosecutor, his voice deep and forceful. "This was a calculated, deliberate act. Margaret Hollis purchased cyanide. She mixed it. She placed it in cups and gave it to the 5 children who trusted her more than anyone in the world, and she did this without hesitation." He turned to face the jury, holding up a photo of Ethan, Logan, Sophie, Caleb, and Emma. "These are the faces of her victims. They were not strangers. They were her flesh and blood. If this does not warrant the ultimate penalty, then what does?" Across the aisle, Maggie's defense attorney, Laura Chen, sat quietly, waiting for her turn. When she rose, her tone was different, calm, measured, almost pleading. "No one in this room will dispute that 5 young lives were lost in the most tragic way imaginable," Chen began. "But I ask you to look deeper, beyond the headlines, beyond the word monster. I ask you to see a 71-year-old woman who was drowning physically, emotionally, financially. She was abandoned by the very people who should have shared her burden. And the system that could have stepped in didn't." Chen placed her hands gently on the defense table. "She is not a hardened criminal. She is a grandmother who had no criminal record, no violent past. But she reached a breaking point. This case is not as simple as the prosecution wants you to believe. The trial stretched over 3 long weeks. The prosecution called Rick, the pest control store owner, to the stand. He testified about selling Maggie the jar of cyanide, explaining how she had claimed it was for rats. Paramedics described the scene in graphic detail, their voices steady, but their eyes betraying the memory. The medical examiner explained that the dose given to each child was lethal within minutes. The jury flinched when photographs were shown: the small, overturned cups, the sticky orange puddles, the tiny bodies lying still on the kitchen floor. The defense countered with neighbors like Nancy Dalton, who spoke of Maggie's exhaustion and Melissa's long absences. A retired social worker testified about gaps in child protective services, explaining how cases of elderly caregivers raising multiple young children often went unnoticed until tragedy struck. The most emotional moment came when Melissa was called to the stand. She avoided her mother's eyes, her voice trembling as she admitted she had been struggling and needed time away. When Chen asked if she understood the pressure her mother had been under, Melissa broke down. I never thought she'd. She couldn't finish the sentence. The prosecution, however, seized on her words during cross-examination. You left your children in her care, Briggs said, his voice sharp. And no matter the challenges, she had a choice. She could have gone to the police. She could have called a hospital. She could have knocked on a neighbor's door. But she didn't. She chose cyanide. Melissa could only nod through her tears. After closing arguments, the jury deliberated for 2 days. The courtroom was tense when they returned, every person holding their breath as the 4 persons stood on the charge of first-degree murder for each of the 5 children. The jury found Margaret Maggie Hollis guilty. The sentencing phase began the next morning. The prosecution argued passionately for the death penalty. This was not an act of mercy, Briggs told the jury. It was an act of control. She decided when their lives would end. The law demands the most serious consequence. The defense pleaded for life without parole, pointing to her age, mental health, and lack of prior record. But when the jury returned, their recommendation was clear death. Melissa gasped. In the gallery, someone shouted, "Good," before being silenced by deputies. Maggie herself didn't react. She simply bowed her head, as if the words were a confirmation of something she had already accepted. Judge Whitmore's voice was firm as he read the sentence. You have been convicted of the most serious crime our law recognizes: the intentional, premeditated killing of 5 children. For this, you are sentenced to death by lethal injection, to be carried out on a date to be determined by the Department of Corrections. The gavel struck. The sound seemed to hang in the air, sharp and final. Reporters flooded outside to broadcast the verdict. Across the state, the ruling fueled a storm of opinion. Some saw justice. Others called it state-sanctioned cruelty. That night, in her cell, Maggie lay awake staring at the ceiling. She thought about the courtroom, the faces of the jurors, the sound of Melissa's sobs. And then a thought came quietly, like a whisper in the dark. It's not over yet. In the weeks after the sentencing, Margaret Maggie Hollis was transferred from the county jail to the state penitentiary's death row unit, a concrete block building with narrow slit windows and a silence that seemed to press in from all sides. Her cell was small, a cot bolted to the wall, a stainless steel toilet, and a narrow metal shelf. Meals came through a slot in the door. She was allowed outside for 1 hour a day, alone in a caged yard under the watch of armed guards. Nights were the hardest. She would lie on the thin mattress staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment of the trial, Daniel Briggs's voice booming through the courtroom. The photos of Ethan, Logan, Sophie, Caleb, and Emma, Melissa's sobs on the witness stand, and over it all, the echo of Judge Whitmore's gavel. But one thought refused to leave her. There has to be another way. 2 months into her sentence, a letter arrived. The return address read, State Council for Elder Justice, a nonprofit that advocated for elderly defendants, especially those facing capital punishment. Inside was a note from their senior attorney, Michael Harrow. We believe your case deserves review. If you're willing, we'd like to represent you in an appeal. Maggie stared at the paper for a long moment before picking up the stubby pencil from her shelf and writing back one word. Yes. Harrow visited her a week later. He was in his mid-40s, tall, with an even tone and sharp eyes. He didn't waste time. I've gone through your trial transcripts, he said, setting down a thick folder. The jury saw one side of you. I believe they didn't get the full picture your age, your declining health, the psychological strain you were under. My argument is simple. The death penalty is excessive in your case. Maggie's voice was quiet. Do you think it'll work? Harrow's reply was measured. I think it's worth trying, and I think we have a chance. The months that followed were filled with motions, affidavits, and expert evaluations. Harrow brought in Dr. Elaine Porter, a forensic psychologist who met with Maggie multiple times. Dr. Porter's report described Maggie as severely sleep-deprived, physically unwell, and under chronic stress compounded by financial hardship and complete lack of support. She was operating under conditions that would break most people. Dr. Porter later told the court, while this does not excuse her actions, it does explain how she reached such a breaking point. The appeal gained momentum when advocacy groups joined in the National Alliance for Mental Health, the Association for the Prevention of Elder Abuse, and even a coalition of retired judges who signed a letter questioning the ethics of executing a 71-year-old woman with no prior criminal record. Public opinion began to shift slightly. News coverage reframed the case not just as a horrific crime but as a story about the collapse of a safety net, a mother who abandoned her responsibilities, a father absent from the picture, and a social system that failed to intervene. Then came an unexpected letter from Melissa. Mom, I don't know if I can forgive you, but I also know I left you alone when you needed help. I will speak at your appeal. Maybe it will make a difference. The final appeal hearing was set for late September, more than a year after the murders. The courtroom was less crowded than at the trial, but the atmosphere was heavy. Harrow opened with deliberate calm. This is not a case about innocence. It's about proportionality. The law allows for mercy when circumstances warrant it. My client's actions were born out of desperation, isolation, and the collapse of every support system around her. We ask that her sentence be commuted to life without parole. Briggs, still leading for the prosecution, was equally forceful. She bought the poison. She prepared it. She served it to 5 children. This was deliberate. This was premeditated. Age and hardship don't erase that fact. Then Melissa was called to the stand. She walked slowly, avoiding her mother's gaze. When asked why she was there, she took a breath. I abandoned my kids, she said plainly. I didn't mean to, but I did. I left my mother to handle everything. I'm not saying what she did was right, but I understand how she got there. I don't want her to die for it. Her words hung in the air. Even Judge Whitmore glanced down, as if weighing them. After closing arguments, the 3 appellate judges withdrew. The wait stretched for hours. When they returned, the presiding judge spoke first. This court acknowledges the gravity of the crimes. However, considering the age of the defendant, her lack of criminal history, her documented mental and physical decline, and the failures of the systems meant to provide support, we find the death penalty to be excessive in this case. He turned toward Maggie. Your sentence is hereby commuted to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. A ripple of reaction moved through the room, some sighs of relief, some muttered curses. Harrow leaned toward her and whispered, We did it. Maggie nodded once. Her face remained unreadable, but her eyes for the first time in months seemed to carry something faintly alive, like breath returning to a drowning soul. The news broke within minutes of the judge's ruling. Death sentence commuted for grandmother who poisoned 5 grandchildren. By the time Margaret Maggie Hollis was escorted down the courthouse steps, reporters were already shouting questions over the barricades. "How do you feel about the ruling? Do you think you deserve the death penalty? Do you have anything to say to the children's father?" She didn't answer. Her gaze stayed forward, her steps slow and deliberate as she climbed into the transport van. But outside the courthouse, voices clashed. On one side, a small group of supporters clapped and held signs, "Mercy is justice and the system failed her too." Among them were advocates from elder rights and mental health organizations who had followed her case from the start. They insisted that the ruling was not leniency, but a necessary acknowledgement of the complex circumstances that had led to the tragedy. "She's going to die in prison," one supporter told a local TV crew. "The court didn't excuse what she did. They just refused to kill her. That's not mercy, that's proportionality." On the other side, the crowd was louder and angrier. Family members from the children's father's side stood in a tight line, holding photos of Ethan, Logan, Sophie, Caleb, and Emma. Their signs were blunt: 5 innocent lives, no excuses, justice for the children. "She murdered them in cold blood," said the children's aunt, her voice shaking with rage. "She watched them suffer, and now she gets to live." That's not justice. That's a slap in the face to every parent who's lost a child. The ruling ignited a firestorm online. Cable news panels debated whether the commutation was a victory for compassion or a dangerous precedent. Some commentators argued that the decision sent the wrong message, that age should not shield someone from the ultimate penalty for such a calculated crime. Others countered that executing a 71-year-old woman served no real purpose and ignored the role of systemic failures in the case. Inside prison, Maggie's life shifted from the solitary confinement of death row to the slower, more regulated rhythms of the general population. Her new cell was slightly larger, with a barred window that let in a narrow strip of sunlight each afternoon. She now shared a tier with other inmates serving long sentences. There were work shifts in the laundry, mandatory head counts, and a small library where she spent most of her free time. She spoke little, keeping to herself, but she was no longer entirely cut off from the human world. Whispers followed her, though. Some inmates kept their distance, unable to stomach the idea of befriending a woman who had killed 5 children. Others approached her with curiosity, their questions blunt and invasive. Why did you do it? Did you really not think about what it would do to their mother? 3 months after the ruling, Melissa came to visit. The meeting took place in a stark visitation room, separated by a thick glass panel. Melissa picked up the phone on her side, her hands trembling slightly. "You look older," she said softly. "So do you," Maggie replied. There was a pause long enough for both women to hear the faint hum of the fluorescent lights above them. "I don't know if I can forgive you," Melissa admitted, "but I also know I left you to drown. That's on me, too." Maggie didn't try to comfort her. "What's done is done," she said. Outside prison walls, the case spurred policy debates. Lawmakers proposed new programs to support elderly caregivers raising children, and some called for tighter regulations on the sale of dangerous chemicals like cyanide. But for the families directly touched by the tragedy, no legislation could undo what had been done. The children's father declined interviews, but through his attorney, he released a statement. 5 lives were taken from me. The court may have spared hers, but I will never forgive her." Even within his extended family, opinions diverged. A cousin posted online that while the killings were horrific, the blame did not rest on Maggie alone. "We all knew she was overwhelmed," he wrote. "We all knew Melissa wasn't home most nights, and we all did nothing." Months passed. The media moved on. The house on Maplewood Lane was sold to a young couple who knew only fragments of its history. The porch swing was gone. The marigolds, once Maggie's pride, had long withered. In prison, Maggie's life settled into a quiet, unremarkable routine wake-up call: head count, work duty, lunch, library, evening lockdown. Days blurred together. Sometimes, at night, she lay on her cot and thought about the morning of June 14th, the smell of the orange juice, Caleb's small body in her arms, Ethan's voice saying, "Grandma, I don't feel good." She never cried, not anymore. Her life had been spared. But she knew she was already serving the harshest sentence possible, one that no court had to impose. She had to live with herself. The White House on Maplewood Lane still stands, but it is no longer the same. The porch swing is gone. The hedges have been cut back. Fresh paint hides the weathered siding. To anyone passing by, it's just another modest home in a quiet neighborhood. But for those who remember, it will always be the place where 5 young lives ended: Ethan, Logan, Sophie, Caleb, and Emma, and where Margaret Maggie Hollis crossed a line she could never uncross. Her story will never fit neatly into the boxes of right and wrong. For some, she will always be a murderer, a cold-blooded killer who chose poison over pleading for help. For others, she is a symbol of what happens when someone is left to shoulder a burden too heavy for one person to bear. The truth is tangled in both views. Maggie knew those children better than anyone. She knew their favorite snacks, the sound of their laughter, the way they cried when they were hurt. She also knew exhaustion so deep it hollowed her out. Nights spent staring into the dark with no idea how to keep going. The law judged her for what she did. The appeal spared her from death, but it could not give her back her freedom or erase the morning when orange juice became a weapon. And perhaps the real tragedy lies in that intersection between choice and circumstance. Because the choice was hers, but the circumstances, they were shaped by Melissa's abandonment, by an absent father, and by a system that failed to intervene before it was too late. Her case forces us to ask difficult questions. How much can one person be expected to bear before they break? When does desperation turn into danger, and who is responsible when the safety nets meant to protect the vulnerable fail completely? In prison, Maggie's days now pass in slow repetition. She will never again walk down Maplewood Lane, never plant marigolds in the front yard, never hear the voices of the children she both loved and destroyed. Some say her life in prison is mercy, others call it injustice. But maybe the truth is that it can be both at the same time. The court case is closed, the media has moved on, but the ripples remain in the families torn apart, in the policy debates sparked, and in the memories of a neighborhood that will never see itself as entirely safe again. So I leave the question to you. Was Margaret Maggie Hollis a cold-blooded killer who deserved to die for her crime, or was she a broken woman, driven past the edge by abandonment and a system that didn't care? There are no easy answers. Only the reminder that behind every headline, there's a human story. And sometimes, that story is far darker, far sadder, and far more complicated than we want to believe. If you followed this story to the end, thank you for listening. Cases like this are not easy to hear. They force us to confront the harshest edges of human nature and the failures that allow tragedy to unfold. If you want to hear more stories that go beyond the surface of the crime into the truth of what shaped it, make sure to subscribe and share your thoughts in the comments. Because the conversation doesn't end here.